Hello. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 10, which is on infections. And if you have the PowerPoint in the instructors folder, and you can follow along. Basically, infection is the third leading cause of death in the United States after heart disease and cancer. And worldwide, it causes about a third of the deaths of any other condition. And it's a significant cause of morbidity and mortality. The reasons for this are quite a bit. Number one is the rapid urbanization in many parts of the world, which has resulted in a rapid spread of infection as a large number of people live together. The poverty, the war and the famine, the fact that we travel globally, the fact that we have our food supply that is global. We have encroached on wilderness areas. We have excessively used antibiotics, and sometimes we don't finish those for therapy, and so we have antibiotic-resistant organisms. We have decreases in the federal budget to study infection, denial that there's a problem by governments, and allowing not enough money for research in terms of vaccines and medications for these resistant viruses and bacteria, protozoa, fungus today, and the diminished use of effective insecticides, and the global warming that has allowed a lot of insects and so forth to breed. We also have, when we describe the relationship between microorganisms and humans, we want to look at the symbiotic relationship that we have. And to many organisms, the human body is a place to live, to grow and flourish, and it provides very sufficient nutrients and appropriate conditions of temperature and so forth that they can live and grow. Microorganisms make up some of the normal flora and reside in different parts of the body, like the GI system. And the normal flora there provided with nutrients from the ingested food. In exchange, they produce enzymes that facilitate digestion and use many of the complex molecules found in the human diet. They produce antibacterial factors that prevent colonizations by other pathogenic organisms, and they produce vitamin K, vitamin B, and other metabolites. So this is unlike opportunistic infections, like for instance with HIV, and that can result as a result of the pathogens being able to circumvent the body's defenses and directly cause infection. Many microorganisms pass through the first line of defense, which is our skin, and then other protective barriers, and they leave the normal sites and cause infection elsewhere, especially in an immunosuppressed person. True pathogens bypass these normal defenses, and it's very dependent on the number and virulence of the microorganisms that pass this particular our own body defenses. I want to define some of the important definitions that relate to infection. Incubation, the period where from initial exposure to the pathogen to the onset of the first symptoms. And the microorganism, when it enters the individual, undergoes initial colonization where it is growing and begins multiplying, but is insufficient in numbers to cause symptoms, but later may last from several hours to several years in the body and cause symptoms later on, like a lot of times HIV. Prodromal stage begins with the occurrence of the initial symptoms, which are often very mild, and then like feeling tired, malaise, and then increases in potency. Then you have the invasion period, where the pathogen is multiplying and invading further in the body, affecting the tissue's body's defenses and invading other areas. And then you've got convalescent, and in most stages, that's the period of time where the individual immune and inflammatory systems have successfully removed most of the infection and the symptoms are declining, and may enter a latency period where you have a remission of the symptoms later to exacerbate. And with resolution of the symptoms, maybe when the virus is reactivated later on. And many types of infections can be acute or chronic, and manifestations can arise directly from the infecting organisms or the byproducts of the organisms, and it depends on the pathogenicity of the organism. So they're pretty variable. Fever is one of the most important ones that we see with infection disease. It's not a failure of the body to regulate temperature, rather it is the body temperature is being regulated at a higher level than normal, and it's regulated, as some of you have said in the previous discussion, by the hypothalamus, and this functions as the central thermostat, and a large number of pyrogenic agents can produce fever. Then your body goes into general factors influencing the microbial pathogenicity, and several factors include communicability, which allows the disease to spread from one individual to another, immunogenicity, the ability of pathogens to induce an immune response, infectivity, the ability of the pathogen to invade and multiply in the host, the mechanism of action, how it damages tissue, the pathogenicity, the ability of the agent to produce disease, the portal of entry, the route by which the microorganism gains access to the host, and this can be by direct contact, inhaling the organism, ingestion of the organisms, or bites by an animal or an insect. Virulence indicates the capacity of the pathogen to cause severe disease, like the measles virus is pretty low in terms of the virulence, where rabies is high. Then your body goes into classifications of infectious diseases depending on their prevalence and spread within the community. Endemic diseases have relatively high but constant rates of infection in a particular population. Pandemic is the number of new infections in a particular population greatly exceeds the numbers usually observed. And pandemic is an epidemic that spreads over a large area, either a continent or worldwide. Your book goes into different types of infectious pathogens. You have the bacteria, fungi, parasites, protozoa, and viruses. And the bacteria were the first ones to come about. They were considered to be normal flora and live harmoniously on the body. But we know that bacteria can cause disease, and they can in two ways. They enter the body and grow inside human cells, like for instance tuberculosis, or they can secrete toxins that damage the cells. And they are divided into several categories based on the shape of their cells. Cocci can have round cells that include streptococci and staphylococci. They can be rod-shaped like tetanus and TB, or curved rods like cholera. And so you have, just in terms of an overview, basically different types of bacteria establish a stable colonization and require adhesions to the cell. And bacteria attach through these pili, which are also these thin rod-like projections from the surface. And basically evade the body's defenses, and when they do, it can result in sepsis. If we go into more detail on the difference between exotoxins and endotoxins, exotoxins are the proteins released during bacterial growth, and they're usually enzymes that have highly specific effects, and they include the cytotoxins, neurotoxins, pneumotoxins, enterotoxins, and they can damage cell membranes, activating second messengers and inhibiting protein synthesis. And then you've got the endotoxins, and these are lipopolysaccharides contained in the cell walls of gram-negative bacteria, and they are released during lysis of the bacterial cells. And endotoxins can be released from the membrane of the bacteria either during bacterial growth or when there's treatment with antibiotics. And as the antibiotics destroys the bacteria, the endotoxins still exert their effects, like they can cause fever and activate the inflammatory process. Bacteria resist different ways and bypass the body system in different ways. They can survive inside the cell and hide from our immune system by growing in sites that are poorly protected, like, for instance, inside the bladder and the intestinal tract. Many intracellular bacteria can escape from phagocytosis. Several of them secrete lysins that break down the phagosome membrane, and then the bacteria are released in the cytoplasm where they continue to multiply. They can protect themselves against phagocytosis by producing a large number of toxins and enzymes that kill the phagocytes. And they can also get into the phagocyte's plasma membrane, causing destruction. They can form an anti-phagocytic capsule that, for instance, pneumonia and meningitis, and such coverings inhibit phagocytosis. They are very thick and polysaccharide coverings. They have protein that can bind to fibrinogen and fibrin, and some of them even cause them to secrete a self-protein that does not allow complement activation or phagocytosis. They can also express themselves on the surface molecules of the plasma membrane, and can, as the person develops different levels of antibodies, change their antigens and become resistant to phagocytosis. They can degrade molecules that are involved in the immune and inflammatory reactions. They can evade complement and suppress the person's immune system. They can, of course, become resistant to antibiotics, like I mentioned as well. So bacteria is just one antigen that we have. Then you have the fungi, which are large molecules with very thick walls, and eukaryocytes, and they survive phagocytosis by inhibiting lysozyme enzymes, or replication in the phagosome. You have protozoa that are single-cell, animal-like microorganisms, and they can be divided into 4 categories: amoebae, ciliates, flagellates, and sporozoa. And they normally live in soil or bodies of water, and they can be introduced into the human body and then cause infection, like malaria is an example. They benefit at the expense of the host. They can be in size anywhere from unicellular to large worms, and they can coat themselves. They can degrade the IgA and G. They can vary the antigen expression on the membrane and neutralize antibodies. And then the last one we have is viruses. They cause infections. The word virus comes from the Latin word meaning poison. And unlike bacteria, viruses are not cells. They consist of either the ribonucleic acid or the deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA or RNA, and a protein envelope. They only reproduce in cells of a living organism and thereby are